Qatar Airways called the Airbus A380 the worst decision the company ever made. Etihad grounded all 10 of its A380s, threw the keys in a drawer, and said the jury was still out on whether those planes would ever fly again. Lufthansa sent its entire fleet to a desert in Spain. And do you know what happened next? Qatar still operates 8. Etihad reactivated 8. And Lufthansa is flying its A380s until at least 2030. Every time an airline announces the retirement of the A380, it comes back, like a horror movie character you think died in the previous scene but who shows up again in the hallway. Except there's nothing supernatural here. There's something more interesting than that. The plane that airlines can't wait to retire is exactly the plane that none of them can replace. And understanding why this happens reveals something far deeper than the story of a big jet that refuses to die. It reveals the true state of commercial aviation in 2026.
Aviate has reached 20,000 subscribers passionate about aviation. Our sincere thanks for your support. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications.
In December 2000, Airbus bet nearly 10 billion euros, roughly $10.7 billion, on the development of a single aircraft, the largest passenger plane ever built, $432 million per unit at list price. 2 decks, 4 engines, capacity for more than 500 passengers in standard configuration, or over 800 if you stack everyone in economy. The first commercial flight took place on October 25, 2007, Singapore Airlines, Singapore-Sydney route, flight SQ380. It was almost poetic, with tickets being auctioned for nearly $100,000. But Airbus wasn't building a symbol, it was building a solution to a specific problem. The problem was simple to describe and hard to solve. The world's major airports were overcrowded. Heathrow in London, Frankfurt, Narita in Tokyo, JFK in New York. These hubs have a fixed number of slots, time windows for landing and taking off, and that window doesn't grow. Airbus's logic was straightforward. If you can't have more flights, put more people on each flight. An A380 carrying 500 passengers occupies a single slot. 5 smaller planes carrying 100 passengers each would occupy 5 slots. The math favored the superjumbo. It was the hub and spoke model taken to the extreme. A giant plane flies to a major hub, passengers redistribute onto smaller flights to their final destinations. Total utilization. Boeing disagreed. While Airbus was building the A380, Boeing was betting on the opposite concept: smaller, more efficient planes flying more frequently between more destinations. That was the philosophy behind the 777 and later the 787 Dreamliner. More frequency, more point-to-point routes, no reliance on a giant hub as an intermediary. The two companies made completely opposite bets on the future of aviation, and for a while it looked like Boeing was right. A380 orders never reached the volume Airbus needed to justify the production line. The target was to sell at least 250 units for the program to break even. Exactly 251 were delivered, and production ended in 2021. The last aircraft delivered that same year. At its peak, 14 airlines operated the type. Today, there are 10. But here is the twist that no one fully anticipated. When the pandemic hit in 2020 and air traffic plummeted to nearly zero, airlines seized the opportunity to do what they had wanted to do for years: park the A380s for good, send them to the desert literally, Teruel in Spain, Tarbes in France, Mojave in California. And then they tried to replace them. That's when the problems started to show. When Lufthansa sent its 14 A380s to the Teruel desert during the pandemic, the intention was clear. The plane was too expensive, too large, too complicated. The plan was simple: replace them with A350s and 787s, smaller, more efficient twin-engined aircraft. Except the A350s and 787s didn't arrive. Not because Airbus and Boeing didn't want to deliver, it's that global supply chains collapsed after the pandemic. Component shortages, skilled labor shortages, cascading delays. Lufthansa looked at the delivery schedule, looked at the surging demand for international travel in 2023, and went to retrieve the A380s from the desert. 6 came back, and they are confirmed until at least 2030. Etihad followed a similar path, all 10 A380s grounded, the CEO publicly saying the fleet's fate was uncertain. 4 returned in 2023, today 6 are active, and plans call for keeping the fleet until 2032. Qatar Airways is perhaps the most dramatic case. CEO Akbar Al-Baker called the A380 the company's worst decision. In March 2026, the entire fleet was grounded due to airspace closure resulting from the conflict between Iran and the United States. The expected return date, June 1, 2026, and the planned retirement date was pushed back to 2035. Think about it, the company that hated the plane the most will fly it for another decade. Qantas reactivated all 10 of its A380s and in August 2025 brought the superjumbo back on the Sydney-Dallas route for the first time since COVID. In 12 months, it added 220,000 seats to its international network, and a large share came from the A380s. Singapore Airlines retired 12 of its 24, but the other 12 are still flying in 2026 to London, Sydney, Auckland, Frankfurt, Dubai, Hong Kong, Mumbai. British Airways reactivated all 12 and uses them on its densest routes to North America, Dubai, and Johannesburg. ANA, with its 3 active aircraft, and Korean Air continue operating their A380s even after having mentioned retirement by 2026. So what's the pattern here? Every time an airline tries to replace the A380, it runs into the same wall. There is no aircraft that does what it does. The Boeing 777X, which would be the natural successor for long-haul, high-capacity routes, carries around 426 passengers in typical configuration. It's the closest thing to a replacement that exists. But the 777X still doesn't have certification. First deliveries are expected in 2027, 7 years behind the original 2020 forecast. The Airbus A350-1000, the other option, carries between 350 and 370 passengers in standard configuration. Now do the math. An A380 with 500 passengers in a single slot at Heathrow. To replace that capacity with A350-1000s, you need at least 1.5 aircraft, meaning 2 flights where there was once 1, 2 slots, when Heathrow already has no slots to spare. 2 crews, 2 boarding processes, all the logistics doubled. At ordinary airports, that would just be a cost issue. At the world's most congested airports, it is mathematically impossible. Heathrow has been operating at absolute capacity for years. Frankfurt is in the same situation. So is Narita, so is JFK. It's not that the A380 is the best plane, it's that at these specific hubs, it's the only plane that fits. And now we get to the elephant in the room, or rather the elephant in the hangar. Keeping an A380 flying is not cheap, far from it. Operating costs run between $25,000 and $35,000 per flight hour in 2025. Fuel alone is approximately $12,000 per hour. A 14-hour Emirates flight, for example, costs around $420,000 to operate. To cover that cost, the plane needs close to $1,000 in revenue per passenger, which requires near maximum load factors on virtually every flight. 4 engines instead of 2, maintenance significantly more complex and expensive than an A350 or 787, and the heavy maintenance overhaul known as a D-check, done approximately every 12 years, can cost up to $25 million per aircraft. But there is something even more worrying than the maintenance cost. When Airbus ended A380 production in 2021, it wasn't just the final assembly line that stopped. All the subcontractors, the companies that manufactured specific components for that aircraft, gradually redirected their resources to other programs, the A350, the A321, other projects. The A380 stopped being a priority for dozens of suppliers around the world, and that creates a problem that gets worse over time. Every spare part becomes progressively harder and more expensive to find. It's the same logic as trying to find parts for a car that went out of production 15 years ago. Possible, but increasingly laborious. Global Airlines is a telling example, a British startup that bought an A380 with plans to operate transatlantic routes. Their sole aircraft sat grounded for 139 days, more than 4 months, waiting for a slot at a heavy maintenance facility. The company's CEO publicly confirmed the company was aware of the enormous queues for heavy maintenance slots. 139 days grounded. For a company with a single aircraft, that is nearly fatal. And if a small startup is already feeling that squeeze, imagine what happens when the large fleets all start needing D-checks simultaneously in the second half of this decade. There is one more important detail. The A380 was designed for 100,000 flight hours, the equivalent of roughly 20 years of service. But the pandemic paused the clocks. Planes that sat on the ground for 2 or 3 years didn't accumulate hours, so some aircraft are almost 18 or 19 years old in calendar age, but still have technical life remaining. The oldest Qantas A380 still in operation is nearly 18 years old and now flies to Dallas. But that extra runway isn't infinite, and as the planes age, parts become rarer, maintenance becomes more expensive, and the secondary market, buying or leasing a used A380, barely exists. A midlife A380 is worth between $30 and $50 million today. It cost $432 million when it left the factory. The value collapsed. The lease rate is around $500,000 per month, a fraction of what you would expect for an aircraft of this size. Airlines that returned A380s at the end of lease contracts found that nobody wanted to lease the planes back. They went into storage or were broken up. Emirates went in the opposite direction. It bought back its own leased A380s. It prefers to own the fleet outright rather than return the planes and see what happens. And Emirates brings us to the central point of this whole story. If you take Emirates out of the equation, the A380 is a story of slow decline. With Emirates, it's an entirely different story. The Dubai-based carrier operates 116 A380s, roughly half of all that were ever delivered. It is reactivating additional stored frames and plans to have 110 units active by the end of 2026. It invested $5 billion to refurbish 219 aircraft, 110 A380s and 109 Boeing 777s. New cabins, premium economy, Starlink Wi-Fi, entertainment with 4K OLED screens. Emirates President Tim Clark said the company will continue operating the A380 until 2040. That is not a tentative forecast. It is a commitment of nearly 2 decades to a plane that stopped being manufactured in 2021. But Emirates is a special case. The airline's business model was built around the A380. Dubai is a strategic hub, geographically equidistant from Europe, Asia, and Africa. Emirates connects that hub to 6 continents with high-capacity flights. There are no point-to-point routes. There's a single gravitational center, and the A380 is the perfect plane for that model. In 2024, Emirates recorded the highest annual profit of any airline in the world, profit driven in large part by A380s flying full on high-demand routes. 7 of Emirates' oldest A380s had already been retired, but not scrapped in the conventional sense. They were cannibalized. The parts from those planes are keeping the other 116 flying. It is a fleet that feeds on itself to survive. Tim Clark even pressured Airbus to consider an A380neo, an updated version with more efficient engines. In July 2024, Airbus CEO Christian Scherer responded by saying that the door is not locked, just closed. And while that door remains closed, Emirates continues to be the only buyer, the only operator at scale, and likely the last operator of a plane that changed aviation without ever having dominated the market it set out to capture. So what does the A380 tell us about aviation in 2026? It tells us that the industry planned a future with smaller, more frequent aircraft, and that future was delayed. The 787s and A350s arrived, but not in sufficient numbers at the right time for the right routes. It tells us that the world's most important airports are so congested that a giant, expensive aircraft is still the most logical solution because there are no slots for more planes. And it tells us that when an airline decides it wants to get rid of a plane, operational reality frequently has other plans. The A380 didn't survive because it was loved. It survived because the world that was supposed to replace it still isn't ready.